The origins of the Jewish presence on the Italian peninsula are deeply intertwined with the expansion of the Roman Republic and the subsequent consolidation of the empire. Following the Roman intervention in Judea during the 2nd century BC and the later destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, significant numbers of Judeans were brought to Italy, initially as captives and later as merchants and free citizens. Archaeological evidence from the catacombs of Rome, particularly the Monteverde and Villa Torlonia sites, reveals a well-established community by the 3rd century AD, with epitaphs indicating a population organized into several distinct synagogues. These early inhabitants were not confined to the capital. Maritime trade facilitated the growth of Jewish settlements in port cities such as Ostia and Pozzuoli, where the remains of ancient synagogue structures demonstrate a permanent and sanctioned religious life. The transition from the classical period to the early Middle Ages necessitated a shift in the legal status of Jewish communities as Roman paganism gave way to Christian hegemony. The Edict of Milan in 313 and the subsequent Codex Theodosianus provided the initial legal framework that both protected Jewish religious practice and introduced the first systematic restrictions on their social interaction with the Christian majority. Despite these legislative shifts, the Ostrogothic ruler Theodoric the Great maintained a policy of relative stability in the 6th century, famously stating that while he could not command religion, he would ensure the protection of civil rights. This era of pragmatic tolerance allowed Jewish communities to maintain their roles as vital intermediaries in the Mediterranean economy, particularly during the breakdown of central Roman authority. In the southern regions of the peninsula, specifically in Puglia and Calabria, Jewish life flourished under the administrative structures of the Byzantine Empire and later the Lombard duchies. The city of Venice provides clear archaeological documentation of this continuity, where 4th and 5th century funerary inscriptions in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin attest to a linguistically diverse and culturally integrated population. These southern communities became renowned for their intellectual output, establishing academies that preserved liturgical traditions and contributed to the development of early medieval Hebrew poetry and legal scholarship. The Josephon, a historical chronicle composed in southern Italy during the 10th century, represents the height of this literary achievement, bridging the gap between classical Jewish history and the emerging European consciousness. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews, and did they actually deserve it? By the time the Carolingian dynasty exerted influence over northern Italy, the Jewish population had become an essential component of urban life, providing specialized skills in medicine, linguistics, and the management of international commerce. The collapse of the Exarchate of Ravenna and the subsequent territorial donations that formed the nucleus of the Papal States created a new political reality, yet Jewish communities remained firmly rooted in cities like Ancona, Bologna, and Rome. They functioned under a system of local charters that recognized their status as servi camerae, or servants of the chamber, a legal designation that placed them under the direct protection and fiscal jurisdiction of the sovereign. This early medieval period established the demographic foundation that would persist for centuries, characterized by a resilient community that maintained its distinctive religious identity while participating fully in the nascent economic structures of the Italian peninsula. The transformation of the bishopric of Rome into a sovereign territorial power began with the disintegration of the Byzantine Exarchate of Ravenna and the strategic shift in papal diplomacy toward the Frankish monarchy. In 754, the donation of Pippin established the legal and territorial foundation for the Papal States by granting the papacy authority over the Duchy of Rome, the Exarchate, and the Pentapolis, effectively creating a buffer state in central Italy. This nascent sovereignty was further legitimized through the forged Donation of Constantine, a document that asserted the Pope's right to secular dominion over the Western Roman Empire. Over the subsequent centuries, the patrimony of St. Peter evolved from a collection of fragmented estates into a centralized administrative apparatus, where the Roman pontiff exercised the dual functions of spiritual head of Christendom and temporal prince of a specific geographic domain. The consolidation of this power required the establishment of a robust fiscal and judicial bureaucracy, centered in the apostolic camera. which managed the state's revenues from land taxes, custom duties, and feudal dues. By the 13th century, the papacy had developed a sophisticated system of legates and governors who represented the central authority in distant provinces, such as Romagna, Umbria, and the March of Ancona. The Albornosian constitutions of 1357 provided the definitive legal codification for the state, organizing its territories into provinces and establishing uniform judicial procedures that integrated local municipal laws with central papal statutes. This constitutional framework enabled the papacy to maintain a degree of administrative continuity despite frequent shifts in the geopolitical landscape of the Italian peninsula. During the 15th and 16th centuries, the Papal States functioned as a primary actor in European power politics, maintaining a standing army and engaging in complex diplomatic alliances to preserve their territorial integrity. The papacy of Julius II witnessed a significant expansion of the state's borders through military conquest, bringing cities such as Bologna and Perugia under direct Roman control. This expansion necessitated an increase in administrative personnel, leading to the rise of a professional class of clerics and lay officials who managed the state's complex infrastructure, from fortifications to road networks. The integration of secular governance with religious ideology meant that legal residence and civil rights within the state were increasingly contingent upon ecclesiastical approval, a factor that fundamentally shaped the status of minority groups. The intersection of religious authority and secular law within the Papal States created a unique jurisdictional environment where the Pope's legislative decrees carried the weight of both moral mandate and state statute. As the sovereign of a temporal state, the pontiff issued bulls that regulated every facet of social and economic life, from the management of guilds to the regulation of public health. This centralization of authority reached its zenith following the Council of Trent, as the papacy sought to model the Papal States as a bastion of the Counter-Reformation. The state's administrative apparatus was increasingly deployed to enforce religious uniformity, transforming the geographic boundaries of the papal territories into a strictly defined religious space. This evolution of the Papal States into a modern sovereign power established the political conditions under which the Jewish communities, previously protected by ancient local charters, would eventually be subjected to the centralized will of the sovereign. The economic and legal integration of Jewish communities within the Italian peninsula was predicated on the Condata, a formal contractual agreement between a municipality or sovereign and a specific group of Jewish residents. These charters, which emerged as standard administrative practice during the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, functioned as fixed-term licenses granting the right of residence in exchange for the provision of essential financial services. The Condata was not merely a permission of stay, but a sophisticated bilateral instrument that delineated the specific interest rates allowed for pawnbroking, the amount of annual taxes to be paid to the communal treasury, and the physical boundaries of permitted habitation. In the Papal States, these agreements were typically negotiated for periods of 3 to 5 years, providing the Jewish community with a defined, albeit temporary, legal status that protected them from arbitrary seizure of property or unwarranted expulsion. The necessity of these charters was driven by the prohibition of usury by the Catholic Church, a theological stance that frequently created a credit vacuum in the developing urban economies of central Italy. Jewish financiers, operating outside the constraints of canon law, but within the strict regulations of the Condata, fulfilled the role of primary lenders to the lower and middle classes as well as to the municipal governments themselves. The pawn shops, or banchi di pegno, established under these licenses, provided the liquidity necessary for the functioning of local markets and the maintenance of agricultural cycles. In cities like Perugia, Spoleto, and Viterbo, the Jewish banker became a vital node in the local fiscal infrastructure, often serving as a de facto communal treasurer during times of military expenditure or civic expansion. Beyond the specific sphere of money lending, the Condata frequently included provisions for the practice of other professions that benefited the sovereign's subjects. Jewish physicians, trained in the prestigious medical traditions of the Mediterranean, were often specifically recruited through these charters to serve as municipal doctors or personal attendants to the nobility. The legal framework also facilitated the involvement of Jewish merchants in the textile and livestock trades, where their connections to broader Sephardic and Levantine networks allowed for the importation of raw materials and luxury goods. This commercial diversity ensured that the Jewish presence was not viewed as an isolated fiscal entity, but as a multifaceted participant in the broader mercantile life of the papal territories. The fiscal dependency of the papal administration on the revenue generated by these communities was a primary factor in the preservation of their legal status throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. The apostolic camera meticulously tracked the payments associated with the renewal of condat, viewing them as a reliable and significant source of income for the central treasury. Furthermore, the Jewish community often provided direct loans to the papacy itself, particularly during the costly defensive campaigns against Ottoman expansion or internal Italian conflicts. This economic interdependence created a pragmatism in papal governance that often overrode theological objections to the presence of non-Christians. The condata thus served as the essential stabilizing mechanism of the pre-Reformation era, embedding Jewish populations into the structural core of the state's economy, while providing the legal security necessary for the growth of stable, productive urban communities. The 15th century witnessed a unique convergence of Jewish scholarship and the burgeoning Italian Renaissance, characterized by an unprecedented level of intellectual reciprocity between Jewish thinkers and the Roman humanist elite. This era was defined by the patronage of the Renaissance papacy, particularly under the tenures of Martin V and Nicholas V, whose administrations recognized the value of Jewish expertise in philology, philosophy, and the sciences. The presence of Jewish scholars in Rome was not peripheral, but central to the humanist endeavor of rediscovering classical antiquity, as the study of Hebrew was integrated into the broader curriculum of the Studia Humanitatis. This cultural climate facilitated the rise of figures such as Elijah del Medigo and Johannan Alamano, whose mastery of Platonic and Aristotelian thought allowed them to navigate both the rabbinic academies and the philosophical salons of the Italian nobility. A primary pillar of this intellectual flourishing was the role of the Jewish physician within the papal court. Despite the persistence of theoretical canonical restrictions, several popes appointed Jewish doctors as their personal archiatri, or court physicians, valuing their proficiency in the Greco-Arabic medical tradition. These individuals, such as the famous Bonnet de Latte, who served Alexander VI, functioned as influential intermediaries who could advocate for the civil interests of their co-religionists while participating in the highest levels of Roman social life. Their medical manuscripts, often written in Hebrew but reflecting the latest Latin scientific advancements, demonstrate a profound degree of cross-cultural exchange that influenced the development of early modern clinical practice and pharmacology throughout the peninsula. The advent of the Hebrew printing press in the late 15th century further solidified the Papal States as a center of Jewish literacy and cultural dissemination. Cities such as Rome, Soncino, and Casal Maggiore became early hubs for the publication of liturgical texts, legal codes, and philosophical treatises. The establishment of these presses was frequently supported by local authorities who viewed the production of high-quality books as a marker of urban prestige and economic vitality. This period of intense bibliographic activity ensured the preservation of medieval Judeo-Italian linguistic forms and facilitated the standardization of halakhic practice across the diverse communities of central Italy. The accessibility of printed materials allowed for a more democratic distribution of knowledge, fostering a highly literate society that was deeply engaged with the broader intellectual currents of the Italian Quattrocento. In the realm of finance and diplomacy, Jewish families such as the da Volterra and the da Pisa operated extensive banking networks that provided the liquidity necessary for the ambitious architectural and artistic projects of the Renaissance popes. Their participation in the administrative life of the state extended to the management of municipal contracts and the facilitation of international currency exchanges, which were essential for the functioning of the Roman Curia. This era of integration was marked by a shared aesthetic sensibility, as wealthy Jewish patrons commissioned illuminated manuscripts and ritual objects that reflected the prevailing artistic styles of the period. This cultural zenith, however, remained fragile, as it was predicated on the personal pragmatism of individual popes, rather than a permanent legal reform. The intellectual and social prominence achieved by Jewish elites during this period established a legacy of achievement that would serve as the benchmark for Italian Jewish identity, even as the ideological pressures of the 16th century began to erode the foundations of this Renaissance equilibrium. The religious and political equilibrium of the Italian peninsula was fundamentally destabilized by the publication of Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517 and the subsequent rapid dissemination of Reformation ideologies across Europe. While the Italian territories remained geographically distant from the primary centers of Lutheran and Calvinist agitation, the ideological reverberations of the Protestant revolt necessitated a comprehensive reassessment of papal governance and social policy. The sack of Rome in 1527 by the mutinous troops of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V was interpreted by many within the Roman Curia as a divine chastisement for the perceived decadence of the Renaissance papacy, triggering a move toward austere reform and a rejection of the earlier era's humanistic pluralism. This traumatic event marked the end of the flexible pragmatism that had characterized papal relations with minority groups as the state transitioned into a period of heightened defensive orthodoxy. The emergence of the spirituale and other internal reform movements within the Catholic Church initially suggested a path of reconciliation, but the failure of the Regensburg Colloquy in 1541 solidified the division between Catholic and Protestant Europe. This hardening of theological boundaries led to the establishment of the Congregatio Sancti Officii, or the Roman Inquisition, in 1542, which centralized the suppression of heresy under the direct supervision of the papacy. The Jewish communities of the Papal States, though not the primary targets of the initial anti-Protestant legislation, found their social and legal status increasingly precarious as the Church sought to enforce a unified religious front. The earlier concept of the Jew as a protected witness to Christian truth was gradually supplanted by a view that saw non-Catholic presence as a potential vector for doctrinal contagion or social instability. The strategic requirements of the Counter-Reformation involved the systematic redefinition of the other within the territorial boundaries of the Papal States. As the Church mobilized to regain lost territories in Northern Europe, it simultaneously sought to consolidate its authority at home through the imposition of strict behavioral and residential codes. The fiscal and administrative resources of the state were redirected toward the enforcement of religious uniformity, leading to the gradual erosion of the local autonomy previously enjoyed by Jewish università. The introduction of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum in 1559 provided a legal mechanism for the censorship of non-Christian literature, extending the reach of ecclesiastical control into the private intellectual lives of the sovereign subjects. This shifting landscape was further complicated by the geopolitical pressures of the Mediterranean, where the ongoing conflict with the Ottoman Empire intensified the papal desire for internal ideological cohesion. The association of Jewish mercantile networks with Levantine trade began to be viewed through the lens of strategic suspicion, despite the continued economic necessity of these commercial links. The administrative shift toward centralization meant that the diverse legal arrangements of the 15th century were replaced by a singular, statewide policy of restriction. By the mid-16th century, the political culture of the Papal States had transformed from a patron of Renaissance diversity into a highly regulated confessional state. This transformation established the ideological foundation for the more radical exclusionary measures that would follow, as the papacy sought to reconcile its temporal sovereignty with its mission as the vanguard of the Catholic Restoration. The mid-16th century represented a critical juncture in the administrative history of the Papal States, as the institutionalization of the Counter-Reformation transformed the state's judicial and social priorities. Central to this evolution was the Roman Inquisition, or the Sacra Congregatio Romanae et Universalis Inquisitionis, which was formalized as a permanent standing committee of cardinals. Unlike the medieval inquisitorial models that operated on a local and episodic basis, the Roman Inquisition functioned as a centralized bureaucratic entity with the authority to bypass traditional municipal jurisdictions and feudal exemptions. This institutional shift reflected a broader movement toward absolutism within the papal administration, where the maintenance of doctrinal purity was viewed as an essential prerequisite for political stability and territorial security. As the Inquisition sought to eliminate the remnants of Protestant influence and internal dissent, its investigative reach inevitably extended to the Jewish communities residing within the sovereign's domains. The administrative apparatus of the Holy Office began to implement a policy of systematic surveillance, utilizing a network of local commissaries and secret informants to monitor religious observances and social interactions. The legal procedures of the Inquisition, characterized by the secrecy of testimony and the absence of a vigorous defense for the accused, created an environment of pervasive legal uncertainty for minority groups. This period witnessed the introduction of the House of Catechumens, an institution specifically designed to facilitate and monitor the conversion of non-Catholics, often utilizing the fiscal resources of the Jewish Università to fund its operations. The theological imperatives of the Inquisition were manifested in a series of administrative decrees that targeted the intellectual foundations of Jewish life. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum provided the legal basis for the widespread confiscation and censorship of Hebrew literature, which was scrutinized for perceived anti-Christian polemics or Kabbalistic deviations. The public auto da fe, while less frequent in Rome than in the Iberian Peninsula, served as a powerful ritualized demonstration of the state's commitment to religious uniformity. These public ceremonies were intended to reinforce the social hierarchy of the Counter-Reformation, where the presence of the unbeliever was tolerated only as a visible reminder of the Church's ultimate triumph. The intersection of inquisitorial oversight and civil governance led to the gradual erosion of the ancient privileges that had historically governed the status of Jews in cities like Bologna, Perugia, and Ancona. The Inquisition's mandate to investigate Judaizing tendencies among converts meant that the boundaries between Jewish and Christian social spheres were subject to constant ecclesiastical scrutiny. This jurisdictional expansion was supported by the development of a professional class of inquisitorial lawyers and theologians who codified the restrictive measures into a coherent body of state law. By the 1552s, the Papal States had established a judicial infrastructure capable of enforcing a totalizing religious policy that moved beyond mere segregation toward the active suppression of diverse cultural and intellectual identities. This administrative hardening signaled the final transition from the Renaissance model of pragmatic coexistence to the rigid confessionalism that would ultimately dictate the terms of the 1569 expulsion. The election of Gianpietro Carafa as Pope Paul IV in May 1555 signified the definitive triumph of the hardline faction within the Roman Curia and the formal end of the humanist-leaning papacy. At 79 years of age, Carafa brought to the throne a zealotry honed during his tenure as the primary architect of the Roman Inquisition, viewing the presence of non-Catholic elements within the state not as a fiscal asset, but as a theological contagion. On the 14th of July 1555, only 2 months after his coronation, he promulgated the bull Cum Nimis Absurdum, a document whose title articulated the new ecclesiastical consensus that it was absurd and inconvenient for Jews, whose own guilt had condemned them to perpetual servitude, to live in proximity to Christians. This bull effectively nullified the centuries of condat and local privileges that had regulated Jewish life, replacing a patchwork of negotiated rights with a centralized, discriminatory legal code. The most transformative provision of the bull was the mandate for total residential segregation, requiring that all Jews within the Papal States reside in a single enclosed quarter with restricted entry and exit points. This administrative decree led to the immediate establishment of the Roman ghetto in the Sant'Angelo district, where thousands of individuals were forced to abandon their ancestral homes and relocate into a cramped, walled perimeter. The legislation further stipulated that each city could maintain only one synagogue, a measure designed to diminish the visibility and institutional presence of the Jewish community. Any surplus religious buildings were to be demolished or converted, and their communal assets were frequently seized to fund the state's conversionary efforts. This spatial reorganization was accompanied by a total prohibition on Jewish ownership of real estate. Within a strictly defined grace period, all Jewish-owned land and houses had to be sold to Christians, often at prices dictated by the buyers. Economically, cum nimis absurdum targeted the professional diversity that had characterized the Renaissance era. The bull explicitly forbade Jews from practicing medicine upon Christian patients, a restriction that removed the most influential Jewish figures from the papal court and high society. Furthermore, Jewish merchants were prohibited from trading in essential commodities such as grain and clothing, limiting their commercial activity almost exclusively to the trade of second-hand goods and rags, or strazeria. This legislative impoverishment was reinforced by a ban on Jewish employment of Christian servants, effectively severing the domestic ties that had facilitated social integration. The fiscal burden on the community was simultaneously increased through the imposition of new taxes, including the Tassa dei Poli, intended to fund the House of Catechumens. The social exclusion mandated by Paul IV was finalized through the reintroduction of the badge of shame. Men were required to wear a distinctive yellow hat, and women a yellow veil, whenever they ventured outside the ghetto walls. Failure to comply with these sartorial regulations resulted in severe corporal or financial penalties administered by the Inquisition's local commissaries. This visual marking was intended to replace the individual's civil identity with a collective pariah status, ensuring that the Jewish population remained a socially isolated caste within the sovereign's domain. The 1555 bull established the ideological and structural precedent for the next century of papal policy, transforming the Jewish population from a protected merchant class into a highly regulated and marginalized minority. This systematic disenfranchisement created the administrative momentum that would lead, 14 years later, to the decision for total expulsion from the papal interior. The topographical implementation of the Roman ghetto occurred with extraordinary speed during the summer and autumn of 1555, transforming the Rione Sant'Angelo from an integrated urban district into a strictly controlled enclosure. The site selected for this segregation was a low-lying area situated between the Theatre of Marcellus and the Portico of Octavia, a region that already housed a significant portion of the city's Jewish population, but also contained numerous Christian residences that had to be forcibly vacated. The engineering of the perimeter involved the construction of high stone walls that utilized the existing fabric of ancient Roman ruins and medieval structures to create a continuous and impenetrable boundary. By early October 1555, the physical isolation of the community was complete, with the entrance and egress of the population restricted to a set of heavy wooden gates, most notably the Porta della Pescaria and the gate near the Church of San Gregorio della Divina Pietà. The environmental conditions of the Sant'Angelo district posed severe challenges to the health and safety of the inhabitants, as the area occupied one of the lowest points in the city's topography. The proximity to the Tiber River ensured that the ghetto was the first district to suffer during the river's frequent inundations, with the lack of effective drainage systems leading to stagnant water and the accumulation of river silt within the narrow alleyways. These floods were not merely seasonal inconveniences, but catastrophic events that destroyed food supplies, contaminated water sources, and facilitated the spread of endemic diseases such as malaria and typhus. The structural integrity of the buildings, many of which were ancient and poorly maintained, was further compromised by the constant moisture and the instability of the alluvial soil upon which they were constructed. Because the geographic area of the ghetto was legally fixed while the population continued to grow through both natural increase and the arrival of refugees from the papal interior, the district underwent a process of extreme verticalization. The inhabitants were forced to expand their living quarters upward, adding successive floors to existing structures to create pinnacle houses that towered over the narrow, sunless streets. This demographic density resulted in the highest concentration of human life in the Italian peninsula, with multiple families frequently occupying a single room. To manage this precarious housing situation, a unique legal concept known as the ius gazzaga was established, which granted tenants a form of hereditary leasehold right. This prevented landlords from arbitrarily increasing rents or evicting residents within the ghetto walls, creating a static but stable internal property market that existed independently of the broader Roman real estate economy. The administration of the ghetto's physical security was maintained by a specialized guard force, whose salaries were paradoxically paid for by the Jewish community itself. Each evening at sunset, the massive gates were locked from the outside by the Bargello or his deputies, effectively placing the population under a state of nocturnal imprisonment until the following morning. The internal layout of the ghetto, characterized by the Platua Judiorum and a labyrinth of secondary lanes, was designed to facilitate easy surveillance by papal officials who conducted regular inspections to ensure compliance with architectural and social regulations. This physical environment, a combination of ancient ruin, vertical tenement, and riverside mud, served as the material manifestation of the Counter-Reformation's exclusionary ideology. The walls of the ghetto did not merely provide a boundary of residence. They established a permanent, physical theater of marginalization that would define the sensory and social experience of Jewish life in the sovereign's capital for over 3 centuries. The enclosure of the Jewish population within the physical boundaries of the ghetto was accompanied by a systematic legislative dismantling of the professional and intellectual networks that had historically integrated them into the upper strata of Italian society. This process of institutionalized exclusion moved beyond residential segregation to target the very mechanisms of social mobility, effectively declassifying a population that had previously functioned as a vital scholarly and mercantile elite. The Counter-Reformation papacy recognized that physical walls were insufficient to achieve the desired state of religious uniformity. The social influence derived from specialized knowledge and high-status craftsmanship had to be neutralized through a totalizing prohibition on the liberal and mechanical arts. Central to this intellectual disenfranchisement was the definitive ban on Jewish medical practitioners attending to Christian patients, a restriction that reversed centuries of pragmatism. The papacy of the mid-16th century anchored this prohibition in the decrees of the Council of Trent, which emphasized that the care of the soul was inextricably linked to the care of the body, and thus, a non-Christian physician posed a spiritual risk to the faithful. This policy effectively liquidated the class of Jewish archiatri, who had served the Roman aristocracy, reducing these highly educated professionals to practicing only within the cramped and impoverished confines of the ghetto. The loss of these medical licenses was not merely a personal economic catastrophe, but a profound blow to the community's diplomatic leverage. As the doctor intermediary had long been the primary channel for negotiating communal safety with the sovereign's court, simultaneously, the papal administration targeted the participation of Jewish artisans and merchants in the traditional guild system, or the arti, which governed the production and sale of goods across the peninsula. New ordinances forbade Jewish involvement in the manufacturing of luxury items such as silk, jewelry, and high-end textile sectors, where they had previously achieved remarkable technical skill. The legislation restricted Jewish commercial activity almost exclusively to strazeria, the trade in second-hand clothing and rags. This was not a natural economic shift, but a forced transition designed to create a visible correlation between religious infidelity and material squalor. By legalizing only the most menial forms of commerce, the state ensured that the Jewish community could no longer compete with the Christian middle class, effectively freezing their economic status at the level of subsistence. This era also witnessed the collapse of the Hebrew printing industry, which had earlier defined the Italian peninsula as a center of Jewish literacy. The Roman Inquisition implemented an expurgatio system, where every Hebrew text was subjected to rigorous censorship by ecclesiastical officials, often resulting in the mutilation of manuscripts and the permanent loss of unique liturgical and legal records. The prohibition on Jews holding university degrees further ensured that the younger generation was barred from the emerging scientific and legal discourses of the late Renaissance. As Jewish scholars were excluded from the academies and libraries of the Papal States, their intellectual life became increasingly insular, confined to the internal study of rabbinic law without the cross-pollination of humanistic thought. This systematic erosion of craft and knowledge ensured that by 1569, The Jewish population had been stripped of the professional status and intellectual capital that might have provided a barrier against the final decree of total expulsion. A cardinal development in the transition toward total confessional exclusion occurred in late 1553, when the Roman Inquisition shifted its focus from the residential segregation of the Jewish population to the systematic eradication of their bibliographic heritage. This phase of intellectual repression was precipitated by an internal controversy involving converted Jewish informants, most notably Solomon Romano and Hananel di Foligno, who petitioned the Holy Office to investigate the Talmud for alleged blasphemies against the Christian faith. The Inquisition, under the leadership of Cardinal Gian Pietro Carafa, utilized these denunciations to classify the central text of rabbinic law not as a legitimate religious tradition, but as a subversive and heretical document. On the 12th of September 1553, the Holy Office issued a definitive decree ordering the immediate confiscation and public destruction of every copy of the Talmud found within the sovereign's jurisdiction. The implementation of this decree was timed with strategic precision to maximize its psychological and communal impact. On the morning of the 9th of September 1553, which coincided with the festival of Rosh Hashanah, inquisitorial officials and municipal guards conducted coordinated raids on the synagogues and private libraries within the Roman Sant'Angelo district. The seizure was comprehensive, encompassing not only the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds, but also a vast array of medieval exegesis and legal commentaries that form the core of the Jewish educational system. These volumes, many of which were priceless, handwritten manuscripts, or early incunabula from the famous Soncino presses, were transported in carts to the Campo dei Fiori, a central Roman square historically utilized for the public execution of heretics. Historical accounts of the ensuing bonfire describe a massive scale of bibliographic annihilation, with hundreds of entire sets of the Talmud consumed in a highly ritualized display of ecclesiastical power. The location was intentionally chosen to signify that the errors of the Jewish text were being treated with the same judicial severity as Protestant heresy. The smoke from the Campo dei Fiori served as a visible signal to the rest of the Italian peninsula. Following the Roman precedent, the Inquisition dispatched directives to other major centers, including Bologna, Ravenna, and Ferrara, demanding identical acts of public destruction. In Venice, then a major hub of Hebrew publishing, thousands of additional volumes were burned in the Piazza San Marco, effectively paralyzing the Jewish printing industry and causing an immediate collapse in the Mediterranean trade of Hebrew books. The 1553 decree represented a fundamental shift in papal policy from the earlier Renaissance model of textual censorship to one of total elimination. While previous administrations had sought to redact specific passages deemed offensive, the Counter-Reformation papacy now aimed to sever the historical and legal continuity of Jewish identity by destroying its primary literary foundation. This act of textual erasure was formalized in the subsequent bull Cum Sicut Nuper, issued in 1554, which mandated that all Jews surrender their remaining books under penalty of death or permanent exile. The loss of these texts decimated the internal legal infrastructure of the Jewish communities, as judges were deprived of the precedents and codes necessary to govern communal life. By targeting the written word, the Roman Inquisition ensured that the Jewish population would be intellectually as well as socially isolated, creating a cultural void that rendered the communities of the papal interior increasingly vulnerable to the final edicts of the 1562. The implementation of the restrictive measures mandated by the Counter-Reformation papacy during the mid-16th century precipitated a systemic collapse of the economic foundations that had sustained Jewish life in the Papal States for generations. While the physical confinement of the ghetto in 1555 was the most visible marker of marginalization, the subsequent fiscal erosion was driven by a deliberate state policy aimed at rendering the Jewish presence economically unviable. This period of contraction was characterized by the rapid expansion of the Monte di Pietà, Christian charitable pawn shops established specifically to displace Jewish lenders and eliminate their role as the primary providers of low-interest credit to the urban poor. By the 1560s, these ecclesiastical institutions, supported by municipal subsidies and private donations, had effectively saturated the credit market, forcing Jewish bankers into a state of terminal insolvency. The financial crisis was exacerbated by a series of papal decrees that arbitrarily reduced the maximum interest rates Jewish lenders could charge, often capping them at levels far below the cost of maintaining the mandatory pawnshops. This regulatory encroachment was not merely an act of economic protectionism for Christian subjects, but a strategic maneuver to bankrupt the Jewish Università, the communal administrative bodies responsible for collecting the state's increasingly heavy tax burdens. As the primary source of communal revenue, the profits from money lending evaporated, the Jewish communities were forced to liquidate their remaining assets, including ritual silver and communal property, to meet the demands of the apostolic camera. This resulted in a state of chronic debt that crippled the internal social welfare systems of the ghetto, leaving the most vulnerable populations without recourse during the frequent Tiber floods and subsequent food shortages. Simultaneously, the legal mandate restricting Jewish commerce to the Strazeria, or the trade in second-hand clothing and rags, created a saturated and low-value internal market that could not support the high population density of the ghettos. The prohibition on participating in the mechanical arts and the production of new textiles removed Jewish artisans from the lucrative supply chains of the Italian silk and wool industries. Merchants who had once managed international networks were reduced to scavenging and repairing used garments, a transition that systematically destroyed the community's accumulated capital. This forced pauperization was a central component of the state's ideological agenda, intended to provide a visible, physical correlation between religious nonconformity and extreme material deprivation. The legal impossibility of land ownership further meant that capital could not be anchored in stable assets, leading to a flight of wealth toward more tolerant territories. By the mid-1560s, the economic strain had reached a breaking point, as the Jewish communities in the papal interior were no longer able to pay for the renewal of their local residency licenses. The papal administration viewed this insolvency as a justification for further jurisdictional consolidation, arguing that the Jewish presence had become a fiscal liability to the state. The collapse of the pawnshop system in outlying towns like Viterbo and Perugia signaled the impending end of the Condotta era, as the state proved that it could maintain its own credit infrastructure without minority participation. This period of monetary stagnation and professional exclusion ensured that by 1569, the Jewish population was not only socially isolated, but also financially incapacitated, removing any remaining economic barriers to the sovereign's final decision to implement a total and permanent expulsion from the papal interior. The death of Paul IV in August 1559 triggered a violent popular reaction in Rome, characterized by the destruction of the Pope's statue on the Capitoline Hill and the burning of the Inquisition's headquarters, signaling a widespread rejection of the previous era's fanatical austerity. The subsequent election of Giovanni Angelo Medici as Pope Pius IV in December 1559 introduced a significant shift in the political culture of the Papal States, moving from the zealotry of the Carafa papacy toward a more pragmatic, Milanese-influenced style of governance. Pius IV, whose family background emphasized mercantile success and diplomatic flexibility, recognized that the extreme socio-economic paralysis caused by his predecessor's decrees threatened the internal stability and fiscal solvency of the sovereign's domains. While he did not abolish the institution of the ghetto, his administration implemented a series of moderate reforms that provided the Jewish community with a brief, 6-year window of relative administrative relaxation and legal predictability. A primary component of this respite was the modification of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum through the Tridentine Index of 1564, which was finalized during the closing sessions of the Council of Trent. Unlike the totalizing bibliographic destruction of 1553, the new regulations allowed for the preservation and study of Hebrew texts, provided they were subjected to a process of expurgation rather than outright incineration. This shift permitted the resumption of certain Jewish intellectual activities, and provided a degree of relief to the Hebrew printing industry, which had been effectively moribund for a decade. The papal administration also eased the enforcement of the restrictive professional bans, allowing Jewish merchants greater latitude in international trade and permitting a limited number of Jewish physicians to consult with Christian patients under specific state-monitored conditions. Economically, the papacy of Pius IV prioritized the revitalization of the state's commercial hubs, most notably the port of Ancona, which was essential for the fiscal health of the Adriatic provinces. The Pope issued new charters that encouraged the return of Levantine and Sephardic merchants, promising them protection from inquisitorial overreach and the preservation of their commercial assets. This pragmatism extended to the Roman ghetto, where the rigid enforcement of the yellow hat requirement was frequently ignored by municipal officials in exchange for increased tax contributions. The Jewish Università were permitted to renegotiate their debts and reorganize their communal charities, leading to a temporary stabilization of the internal ghetto economy. This period witnessed a modest vertical expansion of ghetto housing as the community felt sufficiently secure to invest in the structural maintenance of their residences. The Council of Trent's conclusion in 1563 established a new ecclesiological framework that emphasized the internal reform of the Catholic hierarchy over the immediate and violent suppression of all nonconformist elements. Pius IV utilized this period of doctrinal consolidation to focus on major architectural and infrastructural projects, such as the construction of the Porta Pia and the reinforcement of Rome's fortifications, activities that required the continued participation of Jewish financiers. However, this brief respite remained structurally fragile, as it was based on the personal policy of a moderate sovereign rather than a formal reversal of the cum nimis absurdum. The judicial infrastructure of the Inquisition remained intact, its officials merely awaiting a more ideologically committed occupant of the Petrine throne. The death of Pius IV in December 1565 definitively closed this window of stability, paving the way for the election of Pius V and the final radical escalation toward the total expulsion of Jewish communities from the papal interior. The death of Pope Pius IV in December 1565 precipitated a decisive conclave that fundamentally redirected the political and religious trajectory of the Papal States. On the 7th of January 1566, the College of Cardinals elected Michele Ghislieri, who assumed the name Pius V, signaling a definitive return to the radical ecclesiastical rigorism that had characterized the earlier reign of Paul IV. Ghislieri's background differed significantly from the aristocratic and mercantile lineage of the Medici. A member of the Dominican order, he had risen through the ranks of the Roman Inquisition to serve as the Grand Inquisitor under the Carafa papacy. His ascension represented the institutionalization of the Holy Office at the highest level of sovereign power, as the new pope viewed his temporal authority not as a tool for diplomatic balancing, but as a divinely mandated instrument for the purification of the Catholic world. Pius V's governance was marked by an uncompromising asceticism that permeated the administrative culture of the Roman Curia. He immediately disbanded the lavish courtly structures maintained by his predecessor, redirecting state revenues toward the fortification of the Mediterranean coastline and the systematic suppression of perceived heterodoxy. Central to Ghislieri's ideological program was the concept of the confessional state, a political entity where legal residence and civil protections were inextricably linked to a singular Orthodox Catholic identity. From the earliest months of his papacy, Pius V made it clear that the pragmatic accommodations and local exemptions granted during the previous 6 years were to be regarded as temporary aberrations that undermined the moral integrity of the Papal States. He viewed the presence of Jewish communities in the provincial interior as an administrative oversight that required a final and absolute jurisdictional resolution. The institutional re-empowerment of the Roman Inquisition under Pius V created a unified chain of command that linked the central authorities in Rome with every provincial governor and municipal magistrate. The Pope personally presided over the weekly meetings of the Holy Office, often intervening in individual cases to ensure that the full weight of canonical and civil law was applied. This period witnessed a renewed focus on the surveillance of the Jewish Università as the administration sought to eliminate the remaining social and intellectual overlaps between the Jewish and Christian populations. The lenient expurgation policies, established by the Tridentine Index, were replaced by more rigorous inspections of private libraries, and the professional bans that had been loosely enforced under Pius IV were strictly reinstated through a series of new administrative briefs. By 1567, the diplomatic and fiscal policies of the Papal States had become entirely subservient to the goals of the Counter-Reformation. Pius V's support for the Holy League against the Ottoman Empire and his intervention in the French Wars of Religion required a state of total internal cohesion, which he believed was compromised by the presence of non-Catholic minorities. The administrative preparations for a statewide expulsion were already visible in the systematic census operations conducted by papal commissaries throughout the Romagna and the Marches. These officials meticulously documented the population size, communal assets, and commercial connections of the Jewish communities in the interior, providing the apostolic camera with the logistical data necessary for a mass relocation. The election of Pius V had thus established a sovereign authority whose previous career as an inquisitor and whose current mission as a reformer converged on a singular objective: the physical removal of infidelity from the sacred landscape of the Papal States, setting the stage for the definitive edict of 1569. The administrative reimposition of distinctive attire during the first year of the reign of Pius V represented a crucial phase in the systematic visual segregation of the non-Catholic population. While the physical boundaries of the ghetto established the parameters of residence, the sovereign recognized that the daily commercial interactions permitted by the state necessitated a method of immediate public identification. In April 1566, Pius V issued a series of administrative briefs that revoked the informal exemptions granted during the previous decade, mandating that every Jewish subject, regardless of professional status or previous diplomatic service, carry a visible marker of their religious identity whenever they occupied space outside the ghetto walls. This policy was anchored in the medieval precedents of the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, but it was now deployed with the bureaucratic efficiency of a modernizing state to ensure that the social purity of the Counter-Reformation was maintained in the public sphere. The specific sartorial requirements were delineated with meticulous detail in the papal decrees, focusing on the color yellow as the primary signifier of exclusion. Men were strictly required to wear a head covering of this hue, known as the beretta gialla, which had to be of a specific shade and visibility to prevent the use of ambiguous or darker tones. For women, the decree mandated the wearing of a yellow veil or velo, which served to isolate them from the prevailing fashions of the Roman and provincial nobility. The choice of yellow in the 16th century Papal States was an intentional, semiotic choice. In the iconographic tradition of the era, the color was frequently associated with marginality and treachery, serving as a nonverbal proclamation of the individual's legal and religious status. This visual marking effectively transformed the wearer into a permanent, moving representation of the infidelity that the state sought to manage and contain. The enforcement of these regulations was delegated to the municipal police, or sbirri, and the local commissaries of the Inquisition, who were granted the authority to impose summary financial penalties or corporal punishment on those found in violation. Historical records from the Roman Curia indicate that the state viewed the theft of the badge, the act of concealing one's identity through the adoption of Christian attire, as a severe judicial offense equivalent to fraud. This necessitated a pervasive system of public surveillance, where Christian citizens were encouraged to denounce any individual seen without the yellow hat. The rigidity of this enforcement ended the period of social fluidity that had allowed Jewish merchants to conduct business with a degree of anonymity, forcing them into a state of perpetual self-consciousness that reinforced the psychological barriers of the ghetto system. Beyond its function as a tool for policing, the return of the yellow hat served as a definitive obstacle to the professional reintegration of the Jewish elite. Physicians, scholars, and high-level financiers, who had previously utilized their status to bypass social restrictions, were now visually reduced to the same pariah status as the street peddlers of the Strazeria. This legislative leveling was a central component of Pius V's mission to dismantle the individual prestige of Jewish subjects, replacing it with a collective, marginalized identity that was easily controlled by the state's administrative apparatus. By 1568, the visual landscape of the Papal States had been successfully reorganized. The presence of the yellow badge in the markets and streets of the sovereign cities served as a constant, ritualized reminder of the state's commitment to religious uniformity. This mechanism of visual exclusion provided the final sociological preparation for the mass relocation, as the Jewish population had been rendered so distinct and alienated from the broader social body that their total removal from the provincial interior appeared as a logical extension of established state policy. The systematic centralization of papal authority under Pius V necessitated a fundamental restructuring of the provincial administration, specifically targeting the dozens of small Jewish communities that had existed in the rural and semi-rural districts of the Papal States for centuries. While the Roman ghetto served as the primary model for urban containment, the sovereign's ideological program demanded the total eradication of Jewish presence from the periphery of the state. The towns and villages of the Romagna, Umbria, the Marches, and the Patrimony of St. Peter. This administrative offensive was characterized by the deliberate non-renewal of local condata, the municipal residency charters that had historically provided the legal basis for Jewish life outside the capital. By allowing these contracts to expire without renegotiation, the papal administration effectively transformed established inhabitants into undocumented aliens within their own ancestral territories. The jurisdictional reach of this suppression was facilitated by the creation of a centralized database of Jewish residency, managed by the Apostolic Camera and the Holy Office. Papal commissaries were dispatched to provincial centers such as Viterbo, Perugia, and Orvieto to conduct rigorous audits of local archives, identifying every town where a Jewish presence was documented. These officials carried mandates that stripped local podesta and governors of their traditional rights to grant temporary residency to Jewish moneylenders or merchants. The policy of jurisdictional homogenization meant that the diverse, locally negotiated arrangements of the previous century were replaced by a singular, exclusionary state directive. As these local charters lapsed, the communities in towns like Terracina, Spoleto, and Fano found themselves in a state of legal limbo, prohibited from engaging in any form of contract or commercial transaction. A primary mechanism of this provincial suppression was the systematic closure of small-town synagogues, which the papal administration categorized as unauthorized or redundant under the strict interpretations of Counter-Reformation law. Unlike the Roman synagogues, which were permitted to exist within the ghetto, the places of worship in the outlying districts were viewed as intolerable markers of religious diversity in an increasingly confessional landscape. The physical dismantling of these religious spaces was often accompanied by the seizure of communal assets, including ritual objects and charitable funds, which were diverted to the central treasury or the support of the House of Catechumens. This architectural erasure was intended to signal to the local Christian population that the Jewish presence was no longer a permanent or protected feature of the state's interior. The demographic consequence of the withdrawal of the condata was an immediate and forced consolidation of the Jewish population. Thousands of families residing in the rural hinterlands were faced with the choice of relocating to the overcrowded ghettos of Rome and Ancona, or seeking residence in the independent principalities of the north. This was not a singular event, but a prolonged administrative tightening that occurred between 1566 and 1568, as the state systematically cleansed the smaller urban centers of their Jewish demographic. The loss of these outlying communities decimated the internal networks of the Jewish Università, which had previously relied on rural trade and provincial pawnbroking to maintain their fiscal stability. By 1568, the Jewish map of the Papal States had been radically simplified. The once dispersed population was now concentrated in a few highly monitored urban enclaves, leaving the provincial interior ready for the final definitive decree of total and permanent expulsion. This systematic disenfranchisement of the periphery ensured that by the time the 1569 bull was promulgated, the administrative and social infrastructure of Jewish life in the rural Papal States had already been functionally obliterated. Ancona, situated as the primary maritime gateway of the Papal States to the Adriatic and the Eastern Mediterranean, represented the most significant point of friction between the fiscal requirements of the Apostolic Camera and the ideological mandates of the Counter-Reformation. Unlike the inland agricultural districts, the prosperity of Ancona was fundamentally dependent on the Levantine trade, a complex network of maritime commerce that linked the Italian peninsula with the Ottoman ports of Ragusa, Valona, and Constantinople. The Jewish community in Ancona, particularly the Sephardic and Ponentine merchants of Iberian origin, functioned as the indispensable architects of this commercial hegemony, possessing the linguistic skills, credit networks, and familial ties necessary to navigate the Ottoman markets. Recognizing this economic reality, Pope Paul III had issued a series of innovative charters in 1547 and 1552, explicitly inviting Jewish and New Christian merchants to settle in Ancona, with guarantees of protection from inquisitorial prosecution, effectively creating a zone of legal exceptionalism within the sovereign's domain. This pragmatic arrangement created a jurisdictional paradox that became increasingly untenable as the Roman Inquisition expanded its authority. The strategic importance of the port was quantified by the substantial revenues generated from the dazio, the customs duties on the importation of raw silk, spices, and high-quality wool, which provided a critical financial pillar for the papal treasury. However, the presence of Marranos, converts from Judaism, who had returned to their ancestral faith, presented a direct challenge to the Holy Office's mission to eradicate apostasy. The tension reached a violent culmination in 1555 and 1556, when the Inquisition, acting under the authority of Paul IV, initiated the trial and execution by burning of 25 Portuguese Jews in the Piazza della Mostra. This event triggered a significant international reaction, including an unsuccessful Jewish-led boycott of the port of Ancona, directed from the Ottoman capital, which demonstrated the community's capacity to disrupt the state's maritime economy. Despite these episodes of persecution, the administrative necessity of preserving Ancona as a viable commercial hub forced the papal government to maintain it as one of the two geographic exceptions to the 1569 expulsion decree. The sovereign's advisors recognized that the total removal of the Jewish mercantile class would lead to the immediate diversion of the Adriatic trade to rival ports such as Venice or the Duchy of Ferrara, resulting in an irreversible contraction of papal maritime influence. Consequently, while the Jewish populations of the provincial interior were being systematically liquidated, the Ancona community was subjected to a policy of contained utility. The state replaced the earlier liberal charters with a more restrictive residency model that mirrored the Roman ghetto, imposing strict nocturnal closures and limiting commercial activity to specific wholesale markets, yet stopping short of total removal. The institutional conflict regarding Ancona's status revealed the limits of the confessional state's ability to achieve total religious uniformity without precipitating economic collapse. The Apostolic Camera meticulously calculated the potential loss of revenue against the spiritual goals of the Holy Office, ultimately settling on a compromise that preserved the port's functionality at the cost of its cosmopolitan character. The Jewish community of Ancona thus occupied a precarious middle ground, serving as a vital fiscal instrument for a sovereign who viewed their very presence as a theological affront. By 1569, Ancona had been transformed from a vibrant Porto Franco of the early Renaissance into a highly regulated, monitored enclave where the mechanisms of global trade were allowed to persist only under the constant, vigilant oversight of the inquisitorial apparatus. This strategic retention ensured that the Papal States maintained a maritime presence, even as the rest of the sovereign's territories were being purged of the diversity that had once defined their economic vitality. The legal category of the New Christian within the jurisdictional framework of the Papal States represented a lethal ambiguity that the Counter-Reformation papacy sought to resolve through the rigorous application of canon law regarding apostasy. Unlike the professing Jews, who were categorized as infidels, and thus outside the Church's direct spiritual discipline, the New Christians, descendants of Iberian Jews forcibly baptized in 1497, were legally considered Catholics. Consequently, any return to Jewish ritual or belief was classified as a heretical act of apostasy, placing them under the absolute authority of the Roman Inquisition. By the mid-1552s, the presence of thousands of these Portuguese refugees in the Papal States, particularly in the port of Ancona, had become a primary focus of the Holy Office, which viewed the earlier safe conducts granted by Paul III and Julius III as illicit compromises that facilitated the sin of Judaizing. The administrative assault on this community commenced in earnest in 1555, when Pope Paul IV dispatched the inquisitorial commissioner Cesare de Magistri to Ancona with a mandate to override all previous diplomatic immunities. This operation resulted in the immediate incarceration of approximately 100 individuals of Portuguese origin, whose assets were sequestered by the Apostolic Camera. The subsequent trials, conducted behind the closed doors of the local Dominican convent, centered on the theological distinction between those who had received valid baptism and those whose conversion was deemed coerced. The Roman Inquisition, however, adopted an uncompromising stance, asserting that the mere act of baptism, regardless of intent, conferred a permanent character that subjected the individual to the Church's penal jurisdiction. This interpretation effectively criminalized the entire cultural and religious life of the Sephardic diaspora within the sovereign's territories. The judicial culmination of these proceedings occurred between April and June 1556, marking one of the most severe institutional applications of the death penalty for heresy in the history of the Papal States. While a portion of the accused managed to secure their release through abjuration and heavy financial penalties, 25 individuals refused to renounce their Jewish identity. These men and women were relaxed to the secular arm and executed by burning in the Piazza della Mostra in Ancona. These executions served as a definitive signal that the Papal States would no longer serve as a sanctuary for those fleeing the Iberian Inquisitions, and that the state's judicial apparatus would prioritize doctrinal uniformity over the preservation of maritime commercial networks. The meticulous recording of these trials in the Roman archives demonstrates the state's intent to establish a permanent legal precedent regarding the status of converted populations. The aftermath of the Ancona executions triggered a massive demographic flight of new Christians toward the Duchy of Urbino and the Ottoman territories, as the community recognized that the papal safe-conducts were no longer legally binding. This exodus was accompanied by an unprecedented diplomatic intervention by the Jewish Portuguese elite in Constantinople, led by Gracia Mendes Nasi, who attempted to organize a commercial blockade of the papal port. However, the Roman administration remained unmoved by these economic threats, viewing the purge of the new Christians as a necessary cleansing of the state's spiritual landscape. By 1560, the new Christian presence in the Papal States had been effectively liquidated through a combination of execution, imprisonment, and flight. This institutional triumph of the Inquisition over the new Christians served as the final legal and social rehearsal for the broader expulsion of the professing Jewish population that would follow in 1569, establishing the sovereign's absolute right to define and remove any element deemed incompatible with the Catholic state. On the 26th of February 1569, the bureaucratic and ideological trajectory of the Counter-Reformation papacy reached its definitive legislative climax with the promulgation of the bull Hebriorum Gens Sola. This document, issued under the direct authority of Pope Pius V, functioned as the final jurisprudential instrument for the total and permanent removal of Jewish populations from the vast majority of the sovereign's territorial holdings. Unlike the earlier Cum Nimis Absurdum of 1555, which had prioritized the containment and segregation of the Jewish minority, the 1569 decree operated on a logic of total exclusion, categorizing the Jewish presence as an irreconcilable threat to the spiritual and social integrity of the Catholic state. The bull was not merely an administrative directive, but a highly polemical manifesto that articulated a series of specific, invidious charges including the practice of sorcery, divination, and black magic, as well as the continued exploitation of Christian subjects through usurious contracts. The jurisdictional scope of Hebraeorum gens sola was absolute, encompassing every province, town, and rural district within the Papal States, from the northern reaches of the Romagna to the southern borders of the Campania. The document mandated that all Jewish residents must depart the sovereign's territories within a strict window of 90 days, under the severe penalty of perpetual enslavement or the immediate confiscation of all remaining assets. This ultimatum signaled the end of the legal ambiguity that had characterized the previous 3 years of administrative tightening. By centralizing the power of expulsion in a single statewide edict, Pius V bypassed the traditional municipal authorities and feudal lords who had occasionally sought to protect their local Jewish residents for fiscal reasons. The bull effectively liquidated the legal standing of over 80 Jewish communities, many of which had been integral to the regional economies of the Italian interior for over a millennium. Crucially, the legislation established a bifurcated demographic reality by designating only 2 cities, Rome and Ancona, as permitted areas of residence. This geographic limitation was a strategic decision intended to facilitate the total surveillance of the remaining Jewish population, while maintaining the essential fiscal and commercial functions of the capital and the primary Adriatic court. For the thousands of individuals residing in the provincial interior, the bull represented a catastrophic loss of domicile and civil status, as it provided no mechanism for appeal or local exemption. The Apostolic Camera was tasked with the immediate oversight of this mass relocation, ensuring that the departure of the exiles was accompanied by the definitive closure of all provincial synagogues and the cessation of all Jewish commercial activity outside the designated urban enclaves. The 1569 bull functioned as the final constitutional seal on the transformation of the Papal States into a strictly defined confessional space. By grounding the expulsion in charges of spiritual malfeasance and social subversion, the document provided the moral justification for the state's radical demographic engineering. It represented the ultimate triumph of the inquisitorial mindset over the earlier Renaissance traditions of diplomatic pragmatism and economic integration. As the 90-day deadline commenced, the administrative apparatus of the state was fully mobilized to enforce the categorical removal of a population that had been systematically rendered legally and socially invisible. Hebraeorum gens sola did not merely order a migration. It formally erased the Jewish community as a constituent element of the papal provincial landscape, establishing a new and rigid era of religious homogeneity that would persist for centuries. The jurisdictional map of the Papal States underwent a total demographic contraction in 1569, as the mandates of the sovereign were executed with bureaucratic precision across 80 distinct municipalities. This territorial purge was not limited to the immediate vicinity of the capital, but extended to the furthest reaches of the papal domains, encompassing the legation of Bologna, the Romagna, the March of Ancona, Umbria, and the southern enclaves of Benevento and Pontecorvo. The geographic scope of the expulsion represented the most comprehensive administrative erasure of a minority population in the history of the Italian peninsula, effectively concentrating the entire Jewish presence of the state into 2 highly monitored urban zones. This policy of territorial cleansing was intended to create a vast, religiously homogeneous interior, where the presence of the non-Catholic was no longer a feature of the social or economic landscape. The most significant demographic loss occurred in the city of Bologna, which housed the largest and most intellectually vibrant Jewish community outside of Rome. With a population exceeding 900 individuals, the Bologna community had served as a vital cultural and economic hub for the Romagna region. The implementation of the 1569 bull resulted in the immediate displacement of this ancient community, which included prominent families of physicians, scholars, and silk merchants. Simultaneously, the smaller but historically significant settlements in towns such as Ravenna, Faenza, Imola, and Forlì were liquidated, ending a residency that in many cases dated back to the late Roman Empire. In the province of Umbria, the decree targeted the communities of Perugia, Spoleto, and Orvieto. where the Jewish presence had been inextricably linked to the functioning of local markets and the maintenance of municipal credit systems. In the March of Ancona, the expulsion was particularly devastating for the network of secondary towns that had traditionally supported the maritime commerce of the Adriatic port. While Ancona itself remained an exception, the surrounding communities in Jesi, Recanati, Osimo, and Fano were ordered to vacate their premises, resulting in a sudden and total disruption of the regional trade routes that facilitated the flow of goods into the Italian interior. To the south, in the patrimony of St. Peter and the Campagna, the Jewish residents of Viterbo, Velletri, and Terracina were similarly uprooted. Even the distant papal enclaves situated within the Kingdom of Naples, such as Benevento, were not spared from the sovereign's directive, ensuring that the geographic reach of the Counter-Reformation was visible even in territories physically separated from the central papal landmass. The administrative execution of this geographic removal involved a coordinated effort between the Apostolic Camera and the provincial legates, who were required to provide weekly reports on the progress of the departures. The state's objective was the total urbanization of the Jewish population, transforming a dispersed provincial minority into a strictly contained and easily surveilled urban caste. This strategic concentration allowed the papal government to implement more rigorous forms of social and religious control, while maintaining the fiscal contributions of the community in the two permitted cities. By June 1569, the Jewish geography of the Papal States had been reduced from a complex network of 80 thriving communities to 2 solitary walled enclaves. The provincial interior, once a landscape of cultural and commercial intersection, was now an exclusively Catholic space, its Jewish heritage preserved only in the vacant structures of decommissioned synagogues and the archival records of the Apostolic Camera. The publication of the Bull Hebriorum Gens Sola on the 26th of February 1569 initiated a rigorous and legally binding countdown that allowed the Jewish communities of the papal provincial interior exactly 90 days to terminate their residency. This 3-month ultimatum was not merely a logistical deadline for physical departure, but a strategic period of forced economic liquidation designed to ensure that the Jewish population exited the sovereign's territories without lingering legal or financial ties. The administrative clock, set to expire in late May or early June of 1569, placed thousands of families in a state of immediate judicial paralysis, as the decree effectively suspended the normal protections of civil commerce. During this window, any contract entered into by a Jewish subject was subjected to heightened scrutiny by the Apostolic Camera, which sought to prevent the concealment of assets or the transfer of wealth to non-papal jurisdictions. The primary challenge of the 90-day period was the forced disposal of immovable property and the settlement of complex credit arrangements that had, in many cases, spanned several generations. Because the Jewish residents were prohibited from retaining ownership of land or houses outside the permitted enclaves of Rome and Ancona, they were compelled to sell their holdings in a market where the buyers, primarily local Christian nobility and religious orders, were fully aware of the mandatory deadline. This resulted in a state-sanctioned fire sale environment, where real estate and durable goods were liquidated at values representing only a fraction of their actual worth. The municipal archives of towns such as Bologna and Perugia contain numerous records from the spring of 1569 documenting these hurried transactions, illustrating a massive and rapid transfer of capital from the minority population to the dominant social classes of the Papal States. The bureaucratic oversight of the ultimatum was managed through a network of provincial commissaries who acted as the executors of the sovereign's will. These officials were tasked with auditing the communal accounts of the Jewish Università to ensure that all outstanding taxes, including the heavy assessments for the House of Catechumens, they were paid in full before a family was granted leave to depart. The legal status of debts owed to Jewish moneylenders became a point of significant administrative contention. While the bull aimed to eliminate Jewish credit, the state also had to ensure that the sudden cancellation of loans did not cause a total collapse of local agrarian and artisanal economies. Consequently, the 90-day window saw a flurry of litigation as creditors attempted to recover principal sums, while debtors sought to utilize the expulsion decree as a mechanism for total default. As the deadline approached, the social atmosphere in the provincial towns was characterized by a frantic logistical effort to organize the transport of movable property. Families were required to secure official permits for the movement of wagons and livestock, a process that involved the payment of various exit tolls and protection fees to local governors. The Roman Inquisition maintained a vigilant presence during this period, conducting final inspections of household goods to ensure that no prohibited Hebrew books or ritual objects were being surreptitiously moved. This period of 3 months effectively served as the final stage of the state's deconstruction of Jewish life in the interior, transforming settled inhabitants into a displaced population in a matter of weeks. By the final days of May 1569, the legal and fiscal presence of the Jewish communities in 80 municipalities had been systematically reduced to the few wagons and bundles of belongings that the exiles were permitted to carry as they crossed the internal borders of the Papal States. The conclusion of the 90-day window witnessed the systematic deconstruction of the physical infrastructure that had anchored Jewish communal life in the provincial Papal States for centuries. As the legal status of the Jewish Università was formally terminated, the synagogues often referred to as school underwent a process of state-mandated desacralization and structural repurposing. This architectural erasure was not merely a byproduct of the population's departure, but a deliberate ecclesiastical strategy to overwrite the religious character of the urban landscape. In major provincial centers like Bologna, the Scuola Grande, and the various smaller synagogues belonging to different liturgical rites were immediately seized by the apostolic camera and transferred to local religious orders or confraternities. This transfer of title was frequently accompanied by the physical removal of Hebrew liturgical elements, including the Aron Kodesh and the Bima, and the replacement of these features with Catholic altars and iconography. The resulting structural transformations created a series of architectural palimpsests, where the former sites of rabbinic worship were rededicated as churches or oratories, often bearing names intended to celebrate the triumph of the Counter-Reformation, such as Santa Maria della Vittoria or the Church of the Holy Trinity. Simultaneously, the institutional framework of Jewish education, comprising both elementary schools and higher academies of Talmudic study, was permanently dissolved. These schools had functioned as the primary engines of cultural transmission, ensuring the continuity of the unique Italian Jewish rite and the preservation of specific regional traditions. The closure of these institutions represented a final severing of the intellectual lineage that had connected the provincial communities to the broader Mediterranean academic world. Unlike the targeted bibliographic destruction of 1553, the 1569 closure was a systemic shutdown of the pedagogical space itself. The libraries that remained within these schools, consisting of commentaries, legal codes, and grammatical works not previously confiscated, were often dispersed or sold during the final liquidation of communal assets. The vacancy of these buildings signified more than just the absence of students. It marked the end of a millennium of Jewish pedagogical autonomy in the Italian interior. The removal of ritual objects from these spaces was overseen by inquisitorial officials who ensured that no sanctified items were left to be profaned by secular use, while also prohibiting the exiles from carrying away objects deemed too valuable or politically significant. Torah scrolls that were not successfully transported to Rome or Ancona were frequently placed in the custody of Christian converts or surrendered to ecclesiastical authorities for inspection, a process that often led to their permanent sequestration in cathedral archives. The physical dismantling of the synagogues also involved the stripping of marble plaques, decorative ironwork, and wooden paneling, much of which was sold to fund the expansion of local Catholic infrastructure. This systematic erasure of the Jewish physical presence was intended to achieve a damnatio memoriae, ensuring that future generations would encounter no physical evidence of the communities that had once thrived in the heart of the Papal States. By the summer of 1569, the urban fabric of 80 municipalities had been reconfigured. The quieted classrooms and converted synagogues stood as silent monuments to the totalizing reach of the sovereign's religious policy. The promulgation of the 1569 bull introduced a totalizing legal prohibition on Jewish land ownership throughout the provincial Papal States, mandating a compulsory divestment of all immovable assets within the strict 90-day window. This administrative directive targeted not only urban dwellings, but also the extensive agricultural holdings, vineyards, and commercial workshops that had anchored Jewish family lineages to the Italian soil for generations. The jurisdictional mandate stipulated that any real estate not liquidated by the deadline would be subject to immediate escheatment to the Apostolic Camera or summary confiscation by local municipal authorities. This created a structural environment of forced alienation, where the legal requirement to sell was met with a deliberate and coordinated contraction of the buyer's market. Because the exiles were prohibited from carrying the value of their fixed assets into the permitted enclaves of Rome and Ancona in the form of landed titles, they were forced into a position of absolute fiscal vulnerability. The primary beneficiaries of this forced liquidation were the local Christian nobility and the high-ranking patrician families of cities like Bologna, Perugia, and Ferrara. These elites, possessing the necessary liquidity and legal standing, engaged in a system of predatory acquisition, utilizing the impending deadline to drive property values down to a mere fraction of their assessed worth. Historical records from the period indicate that houses and productive lands were frequently sold for 30 to 40% of their market value, as Jewish owners had no legal recourse to refuse even the most derisory offers. In many instances, the local nobility worked in concert with municipal magistrates to delay the processing of sales until the final weeks of the ultimatum, ensuring that the sellers would accept nominal payments rather than face total confiscation. This process resulted in a massive and rapid consolidation of wealth, as centuries of Jewish capital accumulation were transferred into the estates of the Catholic aristocracy. The economic catastrophe was particularly acute for families whose wealth was tied to dowries and complex inheritance structures linked to specific urban tenements. Under the new papal statutes, these traditional methods of capital preservation were invalidated, as the state refused to recognize Jewish liens or mortgages on properties once they had passed into Christian hands. The loss of these assets represented the destruction of the community's patrimonial reserve, leaving the exiles without the financial base required to establish new livelihoods within the restricted ghettos. Furthermore, the sale of rural estates and industrial spaces, such as dye works and tanneries, decimated the Jewish middle class, which had relied on these properties for professional autonomy. The state-monitored transition of these facilities to Christian guilds ensured that the technical and commercial advantages previously held by Jewish artisans were permanently appropriated by the state's dominant economic actors. The demographic catastrophe initiated by these forced sales extended beyond immediate poverty to the permanent erasure of Jewish genealogical presence in the provincial interior. By stripping the population of its landed interests, the papacy ensured that the exiles could never realistically return to their ancestral towns, as they no longer possessed the legal or economic roots necessary to reclaim their status. The Apostolic Camera meticulously recorded the receipts of these transactions, often extracting a percentage of the sale price as a departure tax, further eroding the remaining capital of the displaced families. By the summer of 1569, the Jewish population of the Papal provinces had been effectively proletarianized, their collective wealth having been absorbed into the infrastructure of the local nobility and the Catholic Church. This systematic disenfranchisement ensured that the expulsion was not merely a relocation of people, but a definitive and irreversible liquidation of the Jewish economic identity in the heart of the Italian peninsula. The physical removal of the Jewish population following the expiration of the 1569 ultimatum necessitated a complex and perilous logistical operation across the primary transit arteries of the Italian peninsula. Unlike the mobile military confederations of the late antique period, such as the Goths or Huns, this migration consisted of a civilian demographic characterized by a significant proportion of the infirm, the elderly, and infants. The administrative requirements for departure were stringent. The Apostolic Camera mandated that every head of household obtain a salvocondodo, or travel permit, which specified the intended route and the final destination of the exiles. These documents were not granted without significant administrative fees, further depleting the remaining liquid capital of families who had already suffered the predatory liquidation of their fixed assets. The resulting movement of thousands of individuals created a state of logistical paralysis along the secondary roads of the Romagna, Umbria, and the Marches, as the exiles competed for limited transport resources. The primary mode of transport utilized for the migration was the two-wheeled barraccio, or the larger four-wheeled cargo wagon, typically drawn by oxen or mules. These vehicles, designed for the short-distance haulage of agricultural goods, were poorly suited for the transit of human cargo over the rugged topography of the Apennines. Families were forced to prioritize the carriage of essential liturgical objects, bedding, and basic culinary implements, often abandoning the bulkier remnants of their domestic lives by the roadside. The logistical strain was compounded by the state's refusal to provide military escorts for the exiles, leaving the slow-moving caravans vulnerable to the endemic banditry that plagued the papal interior during the mid-16th century. While the papal police monitored the movement to ensure compliance with the expulsion, their primary function was the enforcement of travel restrictions rather than the protection of the displaced population. Environmental factors played a decisive role in the physiological toll of the migration. The timing of the departure in late May and June coincided with the onset of the Italian summer heat, which exacerbated the risk of dehydration and heat exhaustion for those traveling on foot. The ancient Roman road networks, including the Via Flaminia and the Via Cassia, though structurally sound, were plagued by thick dust and a scarcity of potable water sources that were not under Christian municipal control. Many towns along the route refused entry to the exiles, forcing them to camp in open fields or on the margins of the highways, where they were subject to various municipal gabelle, or tolls, for the mere right of passage through local jurisdictions. These local taxes, often applied arbitrarily by provincial governors, served as a final fiscal extraction before the population reached the jurisdictional boundaries of the permitted enclaves. The demographic vulnerability of the migration was most visible in the treatment of the sick and the aged, who were often transported in improvised litters or perched atop piles of household goods. The disruption of traditional care networks previously managed by the Jewish Università meant that medical supplies and specialized nutrition were nearly impossible to obtain during the journey. Contemporary reports submitted to the Roman Curia by provincial legates noted a significant mortality rate among the most fragile exiles, yet the administrative pace of the expulsion remained unyielding. The logistical objective of the Papal States was the rapid and total concentration of the population into the designated ghettos, a process that prioritized the efficiency of the purge over the survival of the subjects. By the time the first groups reached the gates of Rome and Ancona, the migration had transformed a formerly integrated merchant class into a physically exhausted and impoverished demographic, their social and economic cohesion shattered by the rigors of the road. The convergence of thousands of exiles upon the two permitted urban enclaves, Rome and Ancona, precipitated an immediate and unprecedented demographic saturation that strained the administrative and physical capacities of the ghetto system to the point of collapse. By the midsummer of 1569, the population of the Roman ghetto surged as individuals from 80 provincial communities arrived at the gates of the Rione Sant'Angelo, seeking the only legal sanctuary remaining within the sovereign's borders. This migration was a strictly monitored convergence overseen by the Sbirri and the Capitani dei Rioni, who conducted rigorous head counts and health inspections at the Porta della Pescaria and other designated entry points. The apostolic camera meticulously logged the arrival of each household, requiring the surrender of provincial travel permits in exchange for residency papers that bound the exiles permanently to the city's restricted and walled Jewish quarter. The physical consequence of this sudden population increase was an emergency intensification of the ghetto's vertical architecture. Since the geographic perimeter of the Sant'Angelo district was fixed by the stone boundaries established in 1555, the only available space for the new arrivals was upward. Existing structures underwent a process of rapid and often unstable accretion, with additional floors and timber-frame mezzanines, known as super-elevazioni, added to the medieval tenements to accommodate the influx. This vertical expansion created a subterranean atmosphere in the lower streets, where sunlight was permanently obstructed, and stagnant air facilitated the rapid transmission of respiratory and enteric diseases. The ius gazaga, the traditional leasehold right, became a source of severe legal friction, as existing tenants were pressured to sublet single rooms to multiple refugee families, leading to a level of human density that far exceeded the district's primitive sewage and ventilation capabilities. The humanitarian crisis was exacerbated by the systemic failure of the communal welfare infrastructure, or the Hebra. The local charitable societies, such as the Gemalut Hasidim, which had historically managed the medical and nutritional needs of the Roman poor, found their resources utterly exhausted by the arrival of thousands of destitute exiles who had been stripped of their landed capital during the 90-day liquidation. Food prices within the ghetto surged due to the state-imposed monopolies and the logistical difficulties of importing supplies into the walled district during the summer heat. Historical records from the Roman Curia indicate a sharp increase in mortality rates related to typhus and malarial fevers, as the increased density overwhelmed the available cisterns and led to the contamination of the district's water supply. In Ancona, the influx of refugees from the Marches and the Romagna created a similar state of socio-economic strain, though the city's maritime connections provided a slightly more flexible commercial environment than the capital. Nevertheless, the competition for the few permitted economic niches, principally the strazeria and wholesale brokerage, led to internal tensions between the established Levantine merchants and the impoverished provincial arrivals. The papal administration utilized this state of crisis to further tighten its surveillance, implementing a system of nighttime patrols within the ghetto walls to prevent the clandestine movement of people. By the end of 1569, the ghettos had been transformed from residential quarters into high-density holding zones where the survivors of the provincial expulsion were subjected to a life of perpetual material scarcity. This demographic concentration ensured that the Jewish presence in the Papal States was no longer a dispersed social reality, but a strictly managed urban problem, centralized for the convenience of the sovereign's inquisitorial apparatus. The geographic and political fragmentation of the Italian peninsula provided a critical strategic alternative for those Jewish families who sought to evade the terminal restrictions of the Papal States. As the provincial interior was systematically liquidated, a significant demographic shift occurred toward the independent principalities of the north, most notably the Duchy of Ferrara, the Duchy of Mantua, and the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. These territories, governed by secular dynasties such as the House of Este and the Gonzaga, operated under a set of administrative priorities where the fiscal advantages of an integrated merchant class often outweighed the immediate theological imperatives of the Counter-Reformation. This migration represented a targeted relocation of human and intellectual capital, as exiles utilized their remaining professional networks to negotiate new privilegi or protective charters with sovereigns eager to stimulate their local urban economies through the introduction of specialized skills, international commercial ties. The Duchy of Ferrara, under the reign of Alfonso II d'Este, emerged as the primary northern repository for the displaced communities of the Romagna. The Estensi administration recognized that the influx of Jewish exiles from nearby Bologna provided a unique opportunity to bolster the city's reputation as a center of Mediterranean trade and scholarship. Unlike the papal administration, the Ferrarese court offered relative jurisdictional autonomy, permitting the establishment of new synagogues and the resumption of the Hebrew printing press, which had been paralyzed in Rome. This period witnessed the transfer of advanced technical knowledge in the production of luxury textiles and the management of wholesale agricultural exports, effectively shifting the economic center of gravity from the papal interior to the northern plains. The presence of wealthy Sephardic families in Ferrara also provided the Estensi with a vital link to the Ottoman markets, ensuring that the city remained a competitive node in the global silk and spice trades. In the Duchy of Mantua, the Gonzaga family implemented a policy of pragmatic inclusion that allowed for a significant expansion of the Jewish community, which reached a population of approximately 3,000 by the late 16th century. The Mantuan Università was granted a degree of internal self-governance that was no longer possible under the Roman Inquisition, facilitating the growth of a vibrant cultural and artistic life that eventually influenced the broader Italian Renaissance. Jewish scholars and musicians were integrated into the courtly life of the Gonzaga, contributing to the development of early modern theater and choral music. This cultural synthesis was anchored in a stable legal framework that protected Jewish property rights and exempted the community from the most debilitating forms of papal taxation, creating a sanctuary for the intellectual traditions that were being systematically erased in the South. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany, particularly the port of Livorno, also began to attract exiles during this period, as the Medici sought to transform the coastal town into a major rival to the port of Ancona. The Livornian laws, though fully codified slightly later, had their roots in the strategic invitations issued to Jewish merchants in the 1,560 and 1,570. By offering total religious freedom and immunity from inquisitorial interference, the Medici successfully diverted a significant portion of the maritime wealth previously held by the papal port. This flight of capital and expertise toward the northern principalities resulted in a profound rebalancing of the peninsula's economic landscape. While the Papal States achieved their goal of religious uniformity, they did so at the cost of an irreversible brain drain, as the skills, knowledge, and commercial networks of the Jewish minority were permanently absorbed into the infrastructure of the rival northern states. The promulgation of the 1569 bull triggered a definitive maritime exodus as a significant portion of the displaced Jewish population sought permanent refuge within the territorial boundaries of the Ottoman Empire. This trans-Mediterranean migration represented a strategic rejection of the restricted life within the papal ghettos in favor of the relatively stable legal environment provided by the House of Osman. The Ottoman state, under the administration of Sultan Selim II, recognized the arrival of the Italian exiles as a unique opportunity to bolster the mercantile and industrial capacity of the Levant. Unlike the ideological rigidity of the Counter-Reformation, Ottoman policy operated on a model of fiscal pragmatism, viewing the specialized skills of the Italian Jewish community, particularly in banking, linguistics, and the textile arts, as essential components for the expansion of Eastern Mediterranean trade. The logistics of this exodus were centered on the port of Ancona and the maritime routes across the Adriatic Sea, where exiles chartered Venetian or Ragusan vessels to facilitate their passage to the east. This movement involved the transfer of substantial commercial expertise, as merchants from the papal interior carried with them the technical knowledge of the Italian silk and wool industries. Upon arrival in the Ottoman ports, these exiles integrated into the existing Sephardic and Romaniote communities, creating a new cultural and economic synthesis. The city of Salonika, often referred to as the Mother of Israel, became a primary recipient of this demographic shift, transforming into the most significant center of textile production in the Mediterranean. The introduction of Italian techniques for dyeing and weaving wool allowed Salonika to secure a near monopoly on the production of uniforms for the Janissary Corps, effectively anchoring the community's status within the Ottoman military-industrial complex. In Constantinople, the Italian exiles found representation at the highest levels of the imperial court through the influence of Joseph Nassi, the Duke of Naxos. Nassi, a prominent Jewish financier of Portuguese origin, utilized his diplomatic leverage to facilitate the settlement of the exiles and to promote the development of Jewish agricultural colonies in the Galilee, specifically in the city of Safed. This period witnessed a remarkable intellectual flourishing in Safed, where the influx of Italian scholars contributed to a resurgence in mystical philosophy and legal codification. The publication of the Shulchan Aruch by Joseph Caro, though completed earlier, saw its widespread dissemination and practical application during this era of demographic concentration in the East. This intellectual vigor was sustained by the wealth transferred from the Italian peninsula, which provided the fiscal foundation for the establishment of new academies and printing presses that surpassed those silenced by the Roman Inquisition. The legal status of the exiles in the Ottoman Empire was governed by the dhimmi system, which granted religious autonomy and protection in exchange for the payment of the sizai, or poll tax. This jurisdictional framework provided a level of administrative predictability that contrasted sharply with the arbitrary and evolving restrictions of the Papal States. The Jewish community functioned as a bridge between the Islamic world and European markets, utilizing their remaining connections in Italy to facilitate the exchange of raw materials and luxury goods. By the 1572s, the maritime exodus had resulted in a profound recalibration of Mediterranean economic power. While the Papal States achieved their goal of territorial religious uniformity, the Ottoman Empire benefited from an influx of capital and expertise that revitalized its urban centers. The departure of the Italian Jewish elite to the Levant ensured that the commercial vitality, once held by the papal provincial interior, was permanently redirected toward the rising ports of the East, marking a definitive shift in the global mercantile landscape of the late 16th century. By the winter of 1569, the administrative objective of the Counter-Reformation papacy had been effectively realized throughout the Italian interior, resulting in a demographic landscape that was, for the first time in a millennium, devoid of a Jewish presence. The immediate aftermath of the expulsion was characterized by a profound and sudden silence in the urban districts that had historically functioned as the vibrant centers of Jewish commercial and social life. In cities such as Bologna, Perugia, and Viterbo, the former Jewish quarters, now legally cleansed of their inhabitants, stood as vacant architectural shells, their narrow lanes and tenements stripped of the signs of daily habitation. This urban vacancy was not merely a physical phenomenon, but a totalizing social disruption, as the networks of neighborly exchange and professional cooperation that had integrated the Jewish minority into the municipal fabric were abruptly severed. The eerily empty streets, mentioned in contemporary municipal chronicles, represented the material reality of a state policy that prioritized ideological uniformity over the preservation of urban vitality. The economic consequences of this demographic vacuum were manifested in a systemic collapse of the regional credit and supply chains. While the state had intended for the Monte di Pieta to replace Jewish moneylenders, the sudden removal of thousands of small-scale creditors created a liquidity crisis that local Christian institutions were ill-equipped to manage. The absence of the Jewish banchi led to a stagnation in the local markets, or mercati, where the lower classes of the Papal States had traditionally relied on Jewish pawnbroking to finance essential agricultural and artisanal activities. The loss of these financial intermediaries resulted in a visible contraction of the circuito del credito, particularly in the rural Romagna and the Marches, where the withdrawal of Jewish capital led to a decline in the production of basic commodities. Furthermore, the total cessation of the second-hand garment trade, a sector previously dominated by Jewish merchants, resulted in a shortage of affordable clothing for the urban poor, a void that Christian guilds were unable to fill due to their focus on higher-value manufacturing. The social fabric of the provincial towns was further compromised by the loss of specialized professional classes, most notably in the field of linguistics and wholesale brokerage. The disappearance of Jewish intermediaries who had facilitated trade between the inland municipalities and the Adriatic ports led to a breakdown in the communication networks that sustained regional commerce. Municipal governors, or podesta, reported to the Roman Curia that the sudden lack of skilled translators and international agents had paralyzed the export of grain and wine, leading to a loss of revenue for the local treasuries. This economic stagnation was accompanied by a sense of social disorientation among the Christian populace, who found the long-established rhythms of urban life, characterized by the coexistence of diverse religious spaces, permanently altered. The empty synagogues and shuttered workshops served as constant visual reminders of the community that had been systematically erased, creating a demographic scar on the urban landscape of the Papal States. The Apostolic Camera and the Holy Office viewed this state of emptiness as a definitive triumph of the confessional state, meticulously documenting the closure of the last provincial università as evidence of the sovereign's spiritual authority. Legates were dispatched to conduct final inspections of the vacated districts, ensuring that no Jewish presence remained, and that all communal assets had been successfully absorbed into the state's fiscal infrastructure. However, the administrative satisfaction of the Roman Curia contrasted sharply with the material reality of the provincial towns, which entered a period of relative isolation and economic provincialism. The expulsion had achieved the goal of religious homogeneity, but it had done so by excising the very elements that had connected the papal interior to the broader Mediterranean world. By the end of 1569, the cleansed streets of the Papal States stood as a testament to the high cost of the Counter-Reformation, as the region began a long period of social and commercial contraction that would define its character for the next 2 centuries. The structural economic decay of the papal provincial interior following 1569 was the result of a profound systemic failure to replace the sophisticated credit and distribution networks that had been dismantled during the expulsion. While the papal administration had ideologically prioritized religious uniformity, the fiscal reality of the subsequent decades revealed a state in terminal economic contraction. The primary engine of this decline was the absolute vacuum in the small credit market, which had previously been sustained by the Jewish Banchi di Pegno. Although the Monti di Pieta were intended to serve as the state-sanctioned alternative, these ecclesiastical institutions operated on a charitable model that lacked the capital flexibility and risk tolerance necessary to support the complex needs of a developing mercantile society. Consequently, the artisanal and agricultural sectors of the Romagna and Umbria were deprived of the essential liquidity required to manage seasonal fluctuations, leading to a visible degradation of the mezzadria, the sharecropping system, as farmers could no longer secure the seed loans and equipment credit formerly provided by provincial Jewish lenders. This financial paralysis was accompanied by an industrial deskilling of the interior, as the technical expertise associated with Jewish artisans was permanently excised from the state's production chains. The Jewish communities had historically held specialized roles in the processing of raw materials, particularly in the dyeing of textiles and the tanning of high-grade leathers, which were essential exports for the papal treasury. The sudden disappearance of these craftsmen resulted in a decline in the quality and volume of manufactured goods, as the Christian guilds proved unable to rapidly absorb the complex chemical and mechanical knowledge required to maintain these industries. This industrial stagnation was further compounded by the collapse of the wholesale brokerage networks. The Jewish intermediaries, who had linked the inland producers with the international markets of the Adriatic, had no Christian counterparts with equivalent linguistic skills or cross-border credit facilities. As a result, the Papal States witnessed a redirection of trade routes, with raw materials from the interior being exported to the rival northern principalities for processing rather than contributing to the sovereign's own manufacturing base. The fiscal paradox of the expulsion became increasingly apparent to the apostolic camera as the 17th century progressed. While the state had realized a significant one-time gain through the confiscation of property and the imposition of departure taxes, it had simultaneously liquidated its most reliable recurring revenue stream. The vigesima, the specific tax levied on Jewish communities, had provided a consistent and predictable income that funded the central administration and the state's defensive infrastructure. The loss of this tax base, combined with the general decline in gabelle revenues from reduced market activity, left the provincial treasuries in a state of chronic deficit. The apostolic camera was forced to compensate for these losses by increasing the tax burden on the Christian peasantry, a move that further stifled local consumption and accelerated the economic isolation of the interior. By 1580, the Papal States had transformed into an economic backwater compared to the vibrant commercial landscapes of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany or the Venetian Republic. The territorial purity achieved by Pius V had resulted in a rigid insular economy that was structurally incapable of competing in the emerging global markets of the late 16th century. The provincial towns, once thriving hubs of cultural and commercial intersection, were now characterized by a lack of social mobility and a reliance on subsistence agriculture. This era of stagnation was not a temporary fluctuation but a permanent recalibration of the region's economic potential. The expulsion of 1569 had successfully removed the other from the sovereign's domain, but in doing so, It had severed the vital economic arteries that connected the papal interior to the broader Mediterranean world, ensuring a period of commercial dormancy that would persist until the modern era. The concentration of the surviving Jewish population within the restricted enclaves of Rome and Ancona necessitated a complex reorganization of communal identity. As refugees from 80 distinct provincial towns were forced to integrate their unique local traditions into a single, high-density urban environment. This period of consolidation witnessed the emergence of a specific ghetto culture that functioned as a curated repository for the diverse customs, or minhagim, of the lost communities of the interior. In the Roman ghetto, this architectural and social reality was most visibly manifested in the construction of the Cinque Skol, a single building that housed 5 separate synagogues representing the different geographic and liturgical origins of the inhabitants. These included the Scola Tempio for the indigenous Italian rite, as well as the Scola Nuova, and the Skol of the Castilian, Catalan, and Sicilian traditions, the latter of which absorbed many of the exiles from the southern papal enclaves. This institutional structure allowed the refugees to maintain their specific ancestral rituals while physically existing within the uniform judicial framework of the Counter-Reformation. The preservation of the lost provincial world was further institutionalized through the evolution of Jewish onomastics, as surnames derived from the names of the expelled communities became permanent markers of geographic origin. Surnames such as Bologna, Viterbo, Perugia, Modigliani, and Sermonetta functioned as linguistic mnemonic devices, ensuring that the genealogical connection to the ancestral towns of the Romagna and Umbria remained central to the individual's identity even generations after the 1569 decree. These names acted as a form of internal territory, providing a sense of historical continuity in an environment where physical land ownership was legally prohibited. The communal registers, or pinaques, meticulously recorded these lineages, creating an archival legacy that stood in opposition to the state's attempt at damnatio memoriae. This focus on lineage ensured that the Jewish community of the capital remained a mosaic of provincial identities rather than a homogenized urban mass. Liturgy served as another critical mechanism for cultural preservation, with the introduction of specific piyutim, or liturgical poems, and special selichot, penitential prayers, that commemorated the destruction of the provincial communities. These texts often utilized the biblical language of exile to describe the 1569 expulsion, framing the loss of the Italian interior within the broader historical narrative of the Jewish diaspora. By incorporating the memory of the expulsion into the annual cycle of fasts and festivals, the community transformed a traumatic administrative event into a sacred historical memory. This liturgical archaeology allowed the inhabitants of the ghettos to maintain a spiritual connection to the synagogues and schools that had been demolished or converted into churches in their former home cities. The transition toward total social isolation also resulted in an inward turn of Jewish intellectual life, where the focus shifted from the humanistic cross-pollination of the Renaissance toward a rigorous and protective rabbinic scholarship. Within the walls of the Roman ghetto, the study of halakha, Jewish law, became the primary tool for maintaining communal cohesion against the constant pressures of the House of Catechumens and the Inquisition. The state-mandated segregation, while intended to marginalize, unintentionally fostered a highly resilient and autonomous internal culture that preserved the linguistic fragments of Judeo-Italian dialects. By the late 16th century, the memory of the lost communities had been successfully transformed from a source of immediate grief into the foundational myth of a new, centralized Jewish identity. This transformation ensured that while the Jewish map of the papal provincial interior had been physically erased, its cultural and genealogical landscape remained vividly preserved within the narrow confines of the sovereign's remaining ghettos. The 1569 expulsion represented the formal termination of a residency that had persisted through the transitions of Roman, Gothic, and Carolingian rule, marking the definitive collapse of the medieval and Renaissance models of minority integration. This legislative act completed the transformation of the Papal States from a diverse territorial aggregate into an ideologically singular confessional monarchy. The jurisdictional finality of Hebraeorum gens sola signified the state's total rejection of the useful infidel paradigm that had sustained the fiscal and social structures of the previous centuries. By prioritizing ecclesiastical uniformity over the established benefits of commercial pluralism, the papacy established a jurisprudential precedent that would regulate the Jewish presence in the capital until the dissolution of temporal power in 1870. The historical significance of this period lies in the absolute centralization of the sovereign's power to define the boundaries of legal residence based on religious conformity. Unlike the 1492 expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula, which was driven by the dynastic unification of the Spanish crowns, the 1569 event was the product of a centralized religious bureaucracy, the Roman Inquisition, exercising its mandate over a sovereign Italian state. The permanent closure of the provincial interior ensured that the Jewish history of central Italy would remain bifurcated, with a vibrant past in the 80 liquidated communities and a restricted, walled existence in the 2 remaining urban enclaves. The administrative records of the Apostolic Camera from the late 16th century demonstrate a systematic transition toward a closed economy, where the absence of the Jewish minority was no longer viewed as an economic loss, but as a spiritual victory for the Catholic Restoration. Furthermore, the 1569 decree altered the demographic trajectory of the Italian peninsula, forcing a redistribution of expertise that benefited the emerging mercantile centers of Northern Europe and the Levant. The Papal States, formerly a crossroads of Mediterranean cultural and financial exchange, became an insular territory where the management of the remaining Jewish population was treated as a perpetual judicial problem, rather than a social reality. The state-mandated invisibility of the community in the interior was maintained through the rigorous enforcement of exclusionary statutes, which were incorporated into the permanent legal codes of the sovereign's provinces. This era of exclusion defined the limits of the Counter-Reformation social experiment, demonstrating the state's capacity to physically reorganize its population to meet the demands of religious orthodoxy. The conclusion of this millennial presence did not merely end a demographic chapter. It fundamentally redefined the role of the Roman pontiff as a temporal sovereign. The 1569 expulsion demonstrated that the state's survival was now tethered to its identity as the guardian of the Catholic faith, a mission that necessitated the total removal of dissenting elements from the sacred landscape. As the exiles were absorbed into the ghettos or driven across borders, the papal provincial interior entered a period of socio-economic stasis.